In the summer of 64 AD, as fire devoured the city, an emperor stood on a rooftop in silk robes playing the lyre. He wasn't saving his people, he was performing. That man was Nero. But what if I told you, Nero wasn't the craziest ruler in history? What if he was just the warm-up act? Because hidden behind every golden throne, behind every sacred crown, are kings and emperors whose minds twisted into something darker than fiction. One worshipped his horse, another banned shoes across an entire empire, and some turned murder into performance art. These weren't legends, these men were real. They ruled with absolute power and paid a devastating price. In this journey, we're not just exploring bizarre royal habits. We're descending into the minds of the men behind the myths, into the madness, obsession, lust, paranoia, and the terrifying silence of unchecked power. So ask yourself this: if no one could ever say no to you, what would you become? This isn't just history, this is a warning, and it begins now. He was born into blood. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, later known as Nero, entered the world with a cursed name and a prophecy that whispered madness. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was power-hungry and cunning. His father, dead before Nero was 4, and by the time he turned 16, his stepfather, the Emperor Claudius, was conveniently poisoned. Most believe Agrippina did it, just to put her son on the throne. From day one, Nero was not raised to rule. He was raised to perform. Trained in poetry, music, and Greek drama, Nero adored the stage far more than the Senate. He believed beauty was divine and that he, himself, was its vessel. He sang, danced, played the lyre, and recited lines from tragedies in perfect meter. But in ancient Rome, emperors weren't meant to act, they were meant to conquer, to lead, to kill. And that was the problem. The early years of Nero's reign were shockingly peaceful. He lowered taxes, banned capital punishment, and even funded public theaters. The people loved him. But Agrippina, his own mother, hated the idea of her son growing independent. She still pulled strings behind the curtain. So Nero did what many men in power do when they feel cornered. He killed her. According to Tacitus, the emperor designed a collapsible boat, hoping to drown his mother at sea in a tragic accident. When that failed, he simply had her assassinated. Some say her final words were, "Strike my womb, for it bore Nero." It wasn't just matricide. It was a declaration, "I am no one's puppet." From that moment on, Nero would no longer act like an emperor. He would act like a god on stage. In 64 AD, flames engulfed the city of Rome for 6 straight days. Ancient sources tell us Nero watched from a tower, playing his lyre and singing of the fall of Troy. The image is unforgettable, a mad emperor basking in the glow of his burning empire, smiling as the screams echoed below. But modern historians debate this. Some say Nero wasn't even in Rome when the fire began. Others claim he rushed back, opened his private gardens to refugees, and personally organized relief efforts. He even blamed a fringe group called Christians for starting the fire, marking the beginning of their brutal persecution. Still, facts don't matter when stories burn brighter than truth. To the Roman elite, Nero had become a monster. To the public, he was a fallen idol. And to himself, he was the star of the greatest tragedy ever written. Nero toured Greece, forcing entire cities to host him in song contests and always winning. Crowds were forced to clap. Senators held their breath. A noblewoman who left mid-performance was ordered to be executed. He married a man, then he castrated another and married him too. He murdered his pregnant wife in a fit of rage, then dressed a young slave boy as her replacement and paraded him as empress. His palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, sprawled across central Rome, complete with a rotating dining room, waterfalls, and a 100-foot statue of himself as the sun god. This wasn't just indulgence. This was a man collapsing into delusion, building a fantasy no one dared challenge. In 68 AD, rebellion brewed, provinces rose, the Senate turned, the Praetorian Guard abandoned him. As soldiers closed in, Nero fled the city barefoot, hiding in a villa outside Rome. There, trembling and desperate, he begged anyone to help him die. No one would. So, in a final act of performance, he stabbed himself in the throat, his last words. What an artist dies in me. For centuries, Nero was remembered as a tyrant, a fire starter, a monster in silk. But was he truly evil? Or was he a sensitive soul crushed by the weight of a crown he never asked for? A boy forced into politics, who only ever wanted to sing. Maybe Rome didn't fall under Nero. Maybe Nero was the first to fall. Under Rome. But where Nero ended in music, the next emperor began with thunder. And what he destroyed was not just Rome, but reality itself. The stage left blood on its curtains. Nero had ended his life with a whisper, "What an artist dies in me." But the empire he left behind didn't vanish in silence. Rome, still drunk on power and performance, looked for a new act, and it found one. Not in a man wiser, not in a leader calmer, but in a boy who had learned to smile while watching monsters rule. Before Nero ever held a lyre, before the Golden House was built, another child was being groomed under darker shadows. His name was Gaius. The world would remember him as Caligula. He was born into spectacle, the son of Germanicus, Rome's most adored general. Caligula was raised not as a child, but as a symbol. Soldiers adored him. The people called him Little Boots for the tiny military uniform he wore, parading through camps like the empire's youngest mascot. But Rome adores loudly and forgets quickly. When his father died under suspicious circumstances, Caligula's family was shattered. His mother and brothers were executed on the whims of the Emperor Tiberius, who then took the boy to his secluded island on Capri. There, among statues and poison, orgies and drownings, Caligula became fluent in the language of survival. He watched Rome's rot unfold behind marble walls. And he learned that power, true power, was not about justice or law. It was about control, total, theatrical, cruel. When Tiberius died, Caligula became emperor at 24. Rome exhaled with relief. The Senate welcomed him as the rebirth of Rome's golden days. He wept during his first speech, spoke of mercy, abolished cruel taxes. Statues of his father were restored. Games were thrown in every district. Even the old guards of the Republic dared to hope. But then something broke. Weeks into his reign, Caligula fell gravely ill. No one knows exactly what happened. Some say epilepsy, others whisper poison. But when he recovered, the light behind his eyes had shifted. His laughter grew cruel, his temper explosive. Mercy gave way to mockery. Rome's golden boy had turned dark. He declared himself a living god not poetically, not symbolically, but as fact. He dressed in Jupiter's robes, paraded through temples, demanded sacrifices in his name. He had statues of deities decapitated and replaced their heads with his own. Worship became mandatory. Dissent became dangerous. When a senator insulted him in private, Caligula invited the man to dinner, placed a butcher's block beside the table, and calmly described the manner of his execution as the man chewed his final meal. The point wasn't just fear, it was performance, power, dramatized. He grew fond of theatrics that blurred reality. He built a floating bridge across the Bay of Baiae, so he could ride across dressed as a god, mocking a prophecy that said he had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the sea. He proved them wrong, not with words, but with absurdity. His beloved horse, Incitatus, was rumored to have a marble stable, a jeweled collar, and a house with its own servants. Whether he truly planned to make it consul is irrelevant. What mattered was the message: your institutions are nothing. I can bend reality. Caligula's relationships became nightmares. He paraded his sisters in public as consorts. He married briefly, then divorced, then remarried, then murdered at public games. He'd point to random spectators and order their deaths on a whim, sometimes for no reason at all. The crowds, once cheering, began to tremble. Fear replaced awe. Whispers turned into prayers. He turned the imperial palace into a labyrinth of humiliation. Senators were forced to grovel naked. Nobles danced for his amusement. Sacred rituals were turned into farce. And yet, no one dared to stop him. Rome had built a stage so vast, so powerful, that even its madmen couldn't be removed without blood. But blood came. In January 41 AD, Caligula walked through a narrow corridor in his palace, flanked by guards. They weren't there to protect him. They were there to end the show. Knives flashed. The emperor fell, stabbed dozens of times. His body left to rot on marble he once called divine. The Senate rejoiced. His statues were shattered. His name was cursed. But the truth lingered. Caligula didn't invent Rome's madness. He inherited it, embodied it, amplified it. He was what happened when a world replaced reason with ritual, truth with performance, and gave its crown to the most theatrical man in the room. He didn't just rule as a god, he ruled like the gods of myth, vengeful, glorious, and doomed. And as Rome mourned or didn't, another shadow stirred, east of the empire, across burning plains and black rivers. A child rode beneath a tattered banner. He would not sing, he would not perform. He would conquer. The empire had seen madness. Now, it would meet fear. They wore crowns, but not with pride. They wore them like shackles. After Nero turned rule into theater, after Caligula blurred godhood with madness, the throne itself began to feel heavier, across kingdoms. Kings inherited not just titles, but isolation minds bruised by expectation, souls bent beneath the weight of ceremonial power and private agony. Charles VI of France was born into glory, young, handsome, praised as the well-beloved. His reign began in calm and competence, but a storm was already gathering behind his eyes. At age 24, while leading his army through the forests of Brittany, Charles froze. Without warning, he drew his sword and attacked his own men. When it ended, several were dead. The king collapsed, trembling, incoherent. He awoke days later, not knowing who he was. The years that followed dissolved into ritualized despair. Charles believed he was made of glass. He refused to be touched. Iron rods were sewn into his robes to prevent him from shattering. Doors were padded. Courtiers whispered in slippers. France, once governed from its throne, was now ruled from behind curtains by whispers and regents, as its monarch hid from the world. Further east, in the vast palace of Topkapi, another king was learning that captivity doesn't always end with liberation. Ibrahim Yildirim of the Ottoman Empire spent 20 years locked in the cafes, a gilded cage for princes, when his brother, Sultan Murad IV, died suddenly. Ibrahim was the last heir. He was dragged out into daylight, trembling, disbelieving. At first, he wept. Then, he ruled. But his rule was not stability. It was recoil. He surrounded himself with women, jewels, and silk. He drowned the empire's treasury in pleasures he didn't understand. He fixated on a concubine known only as the Fat One, showering her with emeralds and titles. Then, one day, driven by rumor and terror, he ordered the execution of his entire harem. Hundreds of women were tied in sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus. The river turned red. He wasn't a tyrant by design. He was what happens when power is handed to a man whose mind has never been allowed to grow. His reign ended in a coup. He was strangled with a silken cord by order of his own mother. Meanwhile, in the cold palaces of Copenhagen, another young king unraveled more quietly. Christian VII of Denmark was witty, charming, and hopelessly unwell. He barked at paintings, laughed during funerals, and wandered the halls muttering to ghosts no one else saw. His queen, Caroline Matilda, sought comfort in the arms of a reformist doctor named Struensee for a brief moment. It worked. The doctor modernized the nation while Christian drifted in and out of reality. But the nobility wouldn't allow it. Struensee was executed. Caroline was exiled. Christian was left alone with his visions and his crown. He lived for decades in silence, technically king, but functionally forgotten. These rulers weren't monsters. They were victims of a system that demanded godhood but offered no grace. Their minds fractured beneath tradition, ceremony, and solitude. They didn't scream, they faded. They were kings, yes, but ones who flinched beneath their crowns. They feared not only enemies, but their own minds. Their madness curled inward, quiet, isolated. They crumbled under the expectations of empires that demanded strength and punished vulnerability. But power never disappears. It mutates. what the mad kings of France, Denmark, and the Ottoman Empire could not control, others would weaponize. In another part of the world, rulers were watching, learning. They saw how fear broke men, and then they learned to make fear serve them. Where Charles trembled, Ivan would strike. Where Ibrahim drowned in silk, Vlad would impale. Where Christian whispered to ghosts, Moctezuma would chant over altars of blood. The age of fragility was not replaced. It was avenged. Russia did not rise on whispered court intrigue or silk-draped ceremonies. It rose on hooves, on smoke, on screams carried across frozen rivers. It did not weep. It roared. Ivan IV was not crowned in peace. He was forged in blood. He became Grand Prince of Moscow at age 3. His mother was poisoned when he was 8. The boyars who governed in his name treated him like a prisoner. They starved him, mocked him, made him watch animals tortured for sport. At 17, when he was crowned Tsar, he smiled. It was not a smile of joy. It was a smile carved from vengeance. For a time, Ivan ruled with justice. He codified laws, expanded trade, opened schools, but then his wife, Anastasia, died another suspected poisoning. He shattered the boyars he believed were behind it. Everyone was... So he built something new, a state within the state, the Oprichnina. Dressed in black, they rode black horses, carrying brooms and severed dog heads, symbols of cleansing and hunting. Their job wasn't justice, it was fear. Entire towns were erased, citizens tortured for rumors, executions became performance, pain became policy. Ivan didn't spare his own family. In a fit of rage, he struck his heir in the skull. The boy died in his arms, the image father and son. Locked in grief, still haunts the paintings that survive. South of Ivan's empire, in the dense forests of Wallachia, another name grew like a shadow, Vlad. He wasn't a monster at first. Vlad was taken hostage by the Ottomans as a child, raised in enemy courts, humiliated and broken. But when he returned, he brought a new doctrine order through terror. He impaled thieves. He impaled diplomats. He impaled entire armies. Forests of corpses lined the roads to his castle. Birds avoided them. Men lost their minds walking through. This wasn't cruelty. It was governance, sharpened. When Ottoman envoys refused to remove their turbans, Vlad had them nailed to their skulls. When nobles challenged him, he invited them to a feast, then burned the hall with them inside. To his people, he was salvation. To everyone else, he became a myth, Dracula, the son of the dragon. But Vlad wasn't alone in ritualized blood. Across the ocean, atop the floating city of Tenochtitlan, another king ruled not with steel, but with sacrifice. Moctezuma II believed the sun required blood to rise, and so he gave it, on stone altars, in front of crowds. He offered human hearts like currency. Tens of thousands died to keep the cosmos in motion. When the Spanish arrived, he welcomed them with gold and incense. He wasn't sure if they were men or gods. Cortés gave him chains in return. Moctezuma died in captivity. The city burned. The temples collapsed. But his vision endured of a world held together not by diplomacy, but by fear and ritual. Ivan, Vlad, Moctezuma. Each wore terror like a cloak. Each believed fear could bind an empire tighter than law. And each proved, for a time, that it could. But fear is a fire. It burns enemies. It burns kingdoms. And eventually, it burns the king. After the blood had dried and the fires dimmed, fear evolved. The next generation of rulers didn't wield terror through spikes and altars. They didn't need to. They discovered a subtler weapon ritual, the control of image, the theater of power, not as illusion, but as absolute law. In France, Louis XIV didn't just rule, he choreographed reality. He ascended the throne at the age of 4 and ruled for 72 years, the longest of any monarch in European history. But he was not content with power. He demanded performance. The Sun King, as he named himself, didn't merely shine, he forced his entire kingdom to orbit him. At Versailles, Louis built a palace so vast and glittering that its walls became more powerful than any sword. It wasn't a home, it was a machine. Every room, every step, every breath within it was regulated by ceremony. Nobles competed not for land or titles, but for the right to hand the king his slippers or hold his nightshirt. He created a hierarchy of gestures. To see him wake was a privilege. To speak to him, a sacred event, he once said. L'État. C'est moi, I am the state. And it was no metaphor. The line between man and institution had been erased. He was France, and France was a stage. Dissent didn't vanish. It simply became invisible. Enemies were not dragged to execution. They were excluded from the theater, forgotten, banished from relevance. While Louis choreographed his rule with velvet gloves, across the channel, another king ruled with fists and appetites. Henry VIII of England was born into glory and expectation, a Renaissance prince, educated, athletic, charismatic, but his legacy would be written not in treaties, but in weddings and funerals. He married 6 times. 2 wives were executed, 1 died in childbirth, 1 was divorced, 1 survived only by outliving him. When the Pope refused to annul his first marriage, Henry tore England away from the Catholic Church, created the Church of England, and declared himself its supreme head. It wasn't reform, it was possession. He wanted not only to rule bodies, but souls. His court became a battlefield of seduction, paranoia, and betrayal. Anne Boleyn, once his obsession, was beheaded after rumors of witchcraft and incest. Her brother was executed alongside her. Henry's paranoia consumed his trust, his health, and eventually his mind. As his body decayed swollen, ulcerated, almost immobile, his power only grew more absolute. Courtiers hid their disgust. Artists painted his image taller, thinner, more divine. He became a walking contradiction, fragile flesh wrapped in unshakable authority. Where Louis used ritual to enslave a court, Henry used emotion, love, rage, abandonment to enslave a nation. In both cases, the crown was no longer just a symbol. It was a stage prop. Centuries later, across oceans and deserts, another man stood alone in white robes, hailed by millions as a living god. Haile Selassie IV, Emperor of Ethiopia, was crowned in 1930 with a title that echoed through time: King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah for many in the West. He was a quiet, bookish reformer, but in the Caribbean, especially Jamaica, he became something else entirely: a messiah. The Rastafarian movement saw him not as a king, but as the second coming of Christ. Bob Marley would one day sing his praises. Pilgrims came from across the sea to kneel at his feet. Selassie said little. He didn't need to. The myth grew faster than he could contain it. At home, he walked palace corridors lined with European paintings, holding court with global leaders. But while the world saw a god-king, Ethiopia saw rising famine, censorship, political imprisonment. Selassie floated above it all, untouchable, distant, swaddled in reverence. He did not rule by terror, he ruled by distance. He ruled by letting others believe. When famine struck, he denied it. When dissent grew, he silenced it with ceremony. In the end, he was overthrown not by armies, but by hunger and radio broadcasts. They found him in a modest room, alone, unarmed, the Lion of Judah, dethroned not by fire, but by silence. Louis, Henry, Selassie, they did not reign with bloodied hands. They reigned with masks, with mirrors, with myth. They understood what even and Vlad never did. Fear doesn't need a spike. Sometimes. It only needs a spotlight. But not all kings mastered that spotlight. Some would try to control it, others would try to seduce it, and some would be consumed by it entirely. But not all kings masked their hunger behind ritual. Some made desire itself their throne and ruled through the surrender of others. The kings who came before ruled with ritual, with fire, with fear, but power, like all predators, evolves, and in its next form. It became intimate. Desire unspoken, weaponized, and divine took the throne. Some rulers conquered by force. These conquered through seduction. Radu of Wallachia was born into shadows, brother to Vlad the Impaler, heir to a land soaked in blood. While Vlad returned from Ottoman captivity with vengeance in his veins, Radu returned with a different gift charm. The Ottoman court was not just politics. It was a palace of intrigue, of whispers behind latticework, of eyes that spoke in glances, and Radu, golden-haired and striking, became more than a guest. He became a favorite. Historians hesitate to say it plainly, but the record is clear. Radu seduced his way into survival. He didn't just serve the Sultan, he swayed him. He turned his beauty into diplomacy, his presence into leverage, while Vlad ruled Wallachia with iron and impalement. Radu took it with silk and submission. He returned not with armies, but with the backing of an empire and the favor of its most powerful man. His reign was brief, but his method lingered. He proved that the body could be more persuasive than the sword, that intimacy could be a strategy of conquest. Across the Mediterranean, in the golden twilight of Cairo, another ruler blurred the lines between passion and piety. Al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah. The Fatimid Caliph of Egypt was revered as both monarch and imam, but reverence quickly gave way to bewilderment. His laws defied logic. He banned the eating of grapes, then he banned fish, then he outlawed women from leaving their homes after sunset. But this wasn't asceticism. This was obsession, spiraling into control. He roamed the streets of Cairo at night in disguise, watching, judging, striking down those who displeased him. His sexuality remains a mystery shrouded in contradictory reports, but what is certain is that his rule was laced with a strange intimacy. He gave gifts with one hand and issued decrees of death with the other, often on impulse, often based on nothing but how he felt in the moment. Then, one day, he vanished into the desert. Some said he died, others said he became divine. To this day, some still worship him as a god. Al-Hakim wasn't just eccentric. He was the embodiment of how desire, when unmoored from reality, becomes theology. His whims became commandments. His control wasn't enforced through armies, but through uncertainty. No one knew what he'd outlaw next, or love next, or kill next. Back in Rome, long before Al-Hakim or Radu, another emperor had already shown how pleasure could be twisted into empire. Tiberius was the second Roman emperor, the adopted son of Augustus, the man who held the reins of an empire that stretched from Spain to Syria. He began as a soldier, stern and disciplined, but years of betrayal, loss, and power without limit transformed him into something else entirely. He left Rome in his later years and retreated to the island of Capri, a paradise that became a private hell. There, in Villa Jovis, he built what some historians describe as a palace of nightmares. Young boys and girls were brought in from across the empire. Some were trained to perform unspeakable acts. Others were never seen again. He kept rooms for pleasure, rooms for punishment, rooms for both. He spoke rarely. He trusted no one. He surrounded himself with statues and spies. No laws restrained him. No senate dared intervene. In the heart of the world's most powerful empire, the most powerful man had transformed desire into doctrine. His isolation didn't weaken him. It gave him space to indulge every impulse, unchecked, unquestioned. His reign ended not with revolt, but with relief. Desire had become dominion, lust, law, affection, strategy. Radu charmed an empire. Al-Hakim spiritualized instability. Tiberius institutionalized depravity. Each in their way showed that the human body, its beauty, its weakness, its hunger was not outside politics. It was politics. Where earlier kings built prisons of ritual, these men built kingdoms from pleasure and made themselves prisoners inside them. Because when desire becomes power, and power loses its shame, the line between ruler and addict disappears. But some kings never blurred that line. They broke it. What comes next is not seduction. It's annihilation. After seduction lost its grip, power looked for permanence. Kings began to fear not death, but obscurity. They didn't want to be loved. They didn't want to be obeyed. They wanted to be remembered forever. And so began the age of obsession. In the sweeping winds of the Mongolian steppe, a child was born beneath a sky so vast it seemed to answer to no one. His name was Temujin. The world would come to know him as Genghis Khan. He didn't inherit an empire. He built one from nothing. Tribes that once warred over cattle now bowed to a single banner, and under that banner, he forged the largest contiguous empire in human history. But conquest wasn't his only weapon. Fear was. He used biological warfare centuries before. It had a name catapulting plague-infected bodies into besieged cities. He sowed paranoia before battle even began, leaving only one survivor in villages to spread tales of slaughter. His image was as much a tool as his sword. But what obsessed Genghis wasn't just land, it was immortality. He banned depictions of his face. His burial site remains unknown. No tomb, no shrine, only a legend etched across continents, to be feared and faceless, eternal and untouchable. That was his idea of godhood. Centuries later, in the mountains of Afghanistan, a new king rose not to unite tribes, but to command their reverence. Ahmad Shah Durrani, the father of modern Afghanistan, wasn't merely a warrior. He was a mystic with a throne, a poet with an army. His eyes were said to pierce like blades, his voice, measured and calm, but his mind, in time, became haunted. As age crept in, Ahmad Shah developed a strange obsession with the dead. He kept the severed heads of fallen enemies in a private chamber. He claimed they whispered to him, offering counsel on war and justice. These heads were not trophies. They were advisors. He cleaned them, prayed beside them. Sometimes, according to court rumors, he wept in their presence. Historians try to explain this as trauma, battle fatigue, madness, but perhaps it was something simpler. He had become so used to ruling over death, he forgot how to speak to the living. His court grew paranoid, his empire restless. Toward the end of his reign, Ahmad spoke less and stared more. His ministers feared his silence more than his rage. When he died, the kingdom fractured, held together only by the ghost of his legend. Far to the west, in the glittering shadows of Prague, another king chased a different kind of immortality. Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor, believed in science, in art, in alchemy, and in everything between. He turned his court into a sanctuary for the strange, astronomers, philosophers, magicians. They all found patronage under Rudolf. He filled his palace with clocks that ran backward, maps of imaginary cities, manuscripts bound in human skin. The boundaries between knowledge and delusion blurred. He sought the philosopher's stone, commissioned mechanical lions, hunted for angels in the night sky. To the outside world, he was enlightened. To those inside his court, he was unraveling. He refused to marry, fathered no legitimate heir, spoke to spirits through mirrors. At times, he locked himself in silence for days. Other times, he hosted banquets where no one dared to speak until he finished whispering to the stars. Rudolf didn't want to rule people. He wanted to rule reality. But reality doesn't like to be ruled. Eventually, his own family staged a coup. He was forced to abdicate. He died alone, surrounded by objects that never loved him back. His empire crumbled, his collection scattered, his name remembered, not for victory, but for obsession. 3 kings, 3 obsessions. Genghis Khan feared memory, so he erased his face. Ahmad Shah feared irrelevance, so he listened to the dead. Rudolf VI feared limits, so he tried to rewrite the laws of nature. Their empires did not collapse with revolution or fire. They faded under the weight of a single truth: the quest to become more than human always ends in being less. Because when power stretches too far beyond armies, beyond reason, beyond death itself, it becomes not divine, but deranged. And yet, for all their madness, one final king remains. And beyond the ruins of obsession, one king stood apart not through blood or mirrors, but through belief. His empire didn't demand worship, it defined it. A king who believed in faith above all, and who nearly bankrupted his soul trying to prove it. After the tyrants and the zealots, the madmen and the mystics, one final figure rises, not with fire, not with seduction, but with silence and light. He ruled not through brutality, but through belief. Akbar the Great, the 3rd Mughal emperor, crowned at 13, was a conqueror, but he never let the sword define him. He expanded his empire across the Indian subcontinent. Yes, but his greatest ambition was not territory. It was truth. He didn't seek to destroy other faiths. He sought to absorb them. In a time of deep religious division, Akbar abolished the jizya tax on non-Muslims, invited Hindu scholars, Jain monks, even Portuguese Jesuits to his court. He asked them not to kneel, but to argue. He listened, he learned, and then he built his own god. In 1582, Akbar unveiled a new faith, Dini Ilahi, the religion of God. It was a fusion of Islam, Hinduism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and his own mystical philosophies. No holy book, no scripture, just him. He didn't call himself divine. He didn't need to. Every article of the faith centered on his presence, his judgment, his voice. What began as tolerance had become consolidation. His court became a theater of faith, with Akbar on the throne not as ruler, but as arbiter of all belief. Paintings depicted him bathed in halos. Poets called him the perfect man. Every question about life, death, virtue passed through him. It was not a reign of fear, it was a reign of reverence. But reverence, too, can become tyranny. Beneath the grandeur of the Fatehpur Sikri palace, whispers began to form. Was this faith or flattery? Was Akbar a philosopher king or a man building a mirror that only reflected his own image? Many followed, many doubted, some feared. He tolerated no mockery of his creed. He silenced dissent with exile, not execution. His greatest tool wasn't violence, it was exhaustion. He wore down opposition with reason, drowned criticism in debate. It felt like peace. It looked like enlightenment. But it was control. Akbar's obsession wasn't conquest. It was unity at any cost. He saw faith not as a path, but as a system to be engineered, and in that vision, he forgot what belief truly is: personal, uncertain, messy. Akbar didn't want worship. He wanted certainty, and certainty, in the hands of a king, is a dangerous thing. He died with his empire at peace. His people mourned, but his new religion, Dini Ilahi, withered within a generation. It could not survive without him. Because faith built on a man can't outlive the man. Akbar wanted to fuse the divine and the earthly, but in doing so, he blurred the difference between God and emperor. And that blur is how most kings fall. One by one, they all try to transcend their own humanity through art, through fear, through lust, through ritual, through philosophy. None succeeded. Nero burned for applause. Caligula crowned himself a god. Charles trembled like glass. Ivan ruled through nightmares. Louis built a palace of mirrors. Selassie was worshipped by those who never saw his famine. Radu, Tiberius, Al-Hakim. They touched the human soul and bent it. Genghis erased himself into myth. Rudolph stared at the stars until they stared back. Akbar built a faith and found himself alone in it. They were kings. They were men. They were myths. But in the end, every one of them stood before the same throne they had ignored their entire lives. The throne of mortality. Because the truth is, no matter how strange their habits, how grand their visions, or how cruel their crowns, every kingdom ends. Every mask falls. Every king is human. And that may be the most terrifying truth of all. They ruled ages long past, but their echoes still shape ours. Because in every screen, every speech, every stage perhaps, one of them still watches back. So now ask yourself, which king never left?